building an audio library for the genealogists with too much time on their hands. Here's your presenter, Malcolm Noble.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being there, and welcome to another bonus episode in the Talk Genealogy podcast. This is the monthly podcast for genealogists with too much time on their hands. Now, as with all the bonus episodes, this one won't disrupt our usual schedule. A regular episode will be posted at 7:30 p.m. UK time on the third day of each month. I'm using this opportunity to post a bonus episode because tonight's discussion could be seen as a supplement to my paper, which was published in the online journal of Genealogy and Family History. It's called Answers in the Wind, Using Local Weather Studies for Family History Research. I suppose it would be sensible to read that essay before listening to this podcast, but I have a feeling if I was in the audience, I'd say, what the hell? It's easier to listen to the podcast and then decide if I want to read the essay. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to give you just a brief flavour of the article, then tell you how to access it and download it if you want, and I hope you will. Now, in that paper, I start out by arguing that records of family weather events are a neglected resource for historians wanting to explain family events and family patterns. Having argued that the weather deserves a place on the family historian's agenda, I offered some reassurance about the availability of information. In the UK, the collation of weather reports commenced in 1860. Gordon Manley's work in the 1950s produced the Central England Temperature Series from 1659, and the National Archive and National Meteorological Archive hold many individual records, including over 1,000 private weather diaries. Perhaps I should say here that the paper does focus on those sources before the commencement of the national data collation in 1860. Then I set out how the family historian can use documents associated with the family chest to support the investigative cycle. Later on tonight we'll talk again about that cycle. With that method in place, explanations can be developed from accessible and easily understood sources, and I show why a systematic approach and a made-to-measure recording method are especially important to the subject, and I conclude with some thoughts around the analysis of family disruption following a weather event. The process leads us towards a closer understanding of our ancestors' relationship with their world. The weather is an experience which we share with them, and a broad awareness of the local climate can provide a means of colouring in their lives. If you would like to read the paper as a sort of foundation to tonight's excursion, search for the Journal of Genealogy and Family History, which is a page on the Registered of Qualified Genealogists website. And I should say at this point that I am not listed on that register. I wouldn't want to misrepresent myself. You'll find a list of published articles. Click on mine to read the abstract, then click the PDF icon for the full paper. And of course there'll be an icon on your browser if you want to download it. And I hope you will, as I say. Tonight I'm going to take the analysis further, demonstrating in detail how you can make the most of those opportunities that the weather presents for digging up history. I want to begin by developing my comments about analysing the effect of family disruption. I'm talking about how family fortunes may change following a catastrophic weather event. But what follows could also be applied to other examples of family disruption. The enclosure of fields had a broad and dramatic effect on my own family. But the cause could also be civil war, the Reformation, and immigration, especially if a branch of your tree is a Huguenot line. Do you remember that investigative sequence we spoke about? Research, analysis, hypothesis, and proof. Now, to underpin our analysis, we're going to try and research the picture of a family. Yes, I guess I am talking about social profiling again. Before and after the event. In the article, I mentioned comparing generations when the new generation had a child who was 9 years old. Why have I chosen that measure? Well, habit, and it works for me. Not a very good answer. We are looking for the effects on the family social profile after things had settled down. Now, rather than put a time on that, after all, family circumstances may mean that some families take longer to recover than others, I have used a measure of family life having returned to normal. In other words, when a second child has survived infancy and the family life is progressing. This is all a little subjective, and the actual example and the age I have chosen may not be as good as some that you can think of, and that's okay. The important factor is consistency. Make sure that by some measure you are comparing like with like. To paint this picture, we need to look at things that make up the social profile: religion, money, property. Review the sources that we've looked at in fairly recent episodes of the podcast. We've spoken about half tax returns, vestry records, and the poll books. But especially I recommend that you look at marriage patterns, trade, legal disputes, and migration. Okay, probably the best guide to an ancestor's standing in the community is to look at the marriage patterns. I wonder if you can remember that advice that I gave on the episode called Take Shakespeare, for example, when I said that every marriage on the family tree should prompt you to search for the will of the new father-in-law. Now, here is a case where that advice comes into play. When we look at the trade and occupation, short term, there's bound to be a hiccup if your ancestor lost work because of the catastrophe. But did the family recover over a couple of generations? Did the artisan, or for example the thatcher, have to accept work as an agricultural labourer? With enclosures, my family certainly did not recover. Legal disputes will always be informative, but you do need to know what you're looking at, and it's hardly a good idea to be guided only by the abstracts. To understand the background that was going on, the full story if you like, you need to look at the full documents if you can find them. And when we consider migration, we need to look a little more carefully. We need to look not so much for relocation simply, but relocation that was different from the contemporary migration patterns. It may be, for example, that we would expect to find a family moving during this period. For this reason, we need to look at the migration pattern not only across the extended family, including collateral lines, but the parish in general, and see if the weather event or other event prompted something unusual. Look for another important consequence of family disruption. This is the effect on family cohesion. Looking at the two mature generations in the way that I've already set out, consider if the family is now spread over a broader number of parishes. Did the event leading to the family disruption actually prompt emigration? In my case, the Enclosure Acts seem to have resulted in more than one branch moving to Australia. Now, before we step further into the analysis stage, let's have our usual 20 seconds of music.
Here's some earlier episodes of the podcast. Episode 15. Let's talk of graves, of worms, of epitaphs. Episode 13 was about the hearth tax. Episode 12, and it was Shakespeare, for example. Episode 9 discussed the medieval pipe rolls. Go to episode 7 for the companions of William the Conqueror. Episode 2, the Herald's Visitations, and our very first episode looked at working with Tudor wills. Building an audio library for the genealogists with too much time on their hands.
Generally, the genealogist follows a linear type of analysis. We go back, we come forward. We may look sideways at collateral lines, but generally we think in sequences, or straight lines if you like. What I'm now suggesting, it challenges us as family historians to develop a forensic approach to our research. As genealogists, we are practiced at developing facts from information, usually by drawing on documentary sources. But when we look at all that information, some of it very, very murky, we need to try to identify links. We need to recognise the information that links our ancestors to dates, places and people. People are the most difficult because they move and change, offering dynamic intelligence as it's called, that is to say, slippery intelligence. We then need to prove how something at one end of the link influenced, or even better, caused something to happen at the other end of the link. In demonstrating that interaction, we begin to understand what is going on beneath the surface. Having established links in changes of behaviour, we next need to identify if it was a causal link or simply a coincidence. And this is where we begin to work with hypothesis. If we are arguing, for example, that the catastrophic event, the weather event in this example, had consequences for our family, we should also be able to say what else would have happened. This would show some corroboration. Conversely, we should always look for what could not have happened if our theory is correct, in a way disproving our theory, because that is just as important. So let's step aside from that introduction to forensic analysis, in family history terms at least. I want to continue by encouraging you to gather an awareness of weather history in the parish where your family lived. Now, as you would expect, as our talks become a little more advanced than the earlier episodes, we're beginning to get to the stage where it's difficult to do justice to one subject without taking on board another aspect of our hobby. I feel that I could be saying all the time, well, that's something we'll cover in more detail in a later episode of the podcast. And that's especially so of tonight's talk. When we look at the weather in a parish, we need to be familiar with the old maps of the area, and of course, that's something we'll cover in more detail in a later episode of the podcast. The preliminary steps may sound a little bit like a nonsense, but I know that I valued an afternoon looking around my family's old parish, trying to pick up an awareness of the weather. Of course, I did this for real, but virtual tools with a map and Google Earth may be something of a substitute. We're wanting to get a feel of how the weather might have behaved, and perhaps we will gain this best by looking at the relief, drainage and communications of the village. Work out how those features could relate to the weather and how life could be if that relationship got out of hand. Relief means the ups and downs, the slopes and flat bits in between. Personally, I've found it especially advantageous to concentrate on the drainage. Water has to go somewhere, in a ditch, stream, river, soakaway or water meadow. And following the water often tells us a lot about the settlement. You will also want to note field names and the names of roads and houses. Some may have a weather connection. Now try and put together a weather timeline for your village using all the sources mentioned in the article which I've quoted tonight. Eventually, it may be that you would want to produce not only a weather timeline, but one of building development, political and industrial change. But relevant to tonight's subject, I think you should note especially, apart from the catastrophic spectaculars, anything to do with harvest, produce prices and wages. You'll be surprising how easy it is to find these. And at this point I want to strongly recommend a particular book for you. It's an old title that I've mentioned before, because it was invaluable when I was starting out. You'll find that David Ardale's Enjoying Archives is very helpful when it comes to recording stray bits of information and linking them into your research. Please do try to get hold of an old copy. I guess this might be something that we'd want to do over a longer time period. As we search for other trails for other purposes, we may want to note down the references to the weather. Perhaps we have been doing family history long enough to learn that we should record and index very broadly as we go along. Remember, nothing is nothing to do with us. And make sure that you note good and bad harvests in the weather timeline. Even though you may think it is an economic variable, it is so often spawned by the weather. Thank you for listening to this bonus episode of the Talk Genealogy podcast, the podcast for genealogists with too much time on their hands. It's been something of a slog, hasn't it? But I hope you're now in a position to make the best of that paper that I've spoken about, and perhaps it's whetted your appetite to take a deeper look at it. Really, that essay on making the best use of weather research in family history serves as tonight's show notes. All the sources are there, carefully documented, that should guide you through the project. Once again, search for the Journal of Genealogy and Family History, and you'll find the paper there as a free download. Please let me know what you think. Don't forget, the regular podcast will be available on the third day of each month at 7:30 UK time. And you can catch up on previous episodes by visiting the website, which is talkgenealogy.blog. My name's Malcolm Noble. Thanks for listening. Good night and God bless.
Building an audio library for the genealogists with too much time on their hands.